Hello, welcome to Human Tech, a podcast about the intersection between humans and technology. My name's Guthrie. I'm here with Susan. Hi, Susan.
Hey, Guthrie.
And you want to tell us about our very special guest today.
Yes, we have a guest today. We have Amy Bucher. And Amy she has this great title that you'll appreciate, Guthrie. Vice President of Behavior Change at MadPow. And we're definitely going to talk about that. And I want to mention that we're going to talk about a book that she wrote recently called Engaged, Designing for Behavior Change. So welcome, Amy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And you and I have messaged a couple times on LinkedIn, and I think we know about each other. But this is actually the first time we've ever, had more than the 5-minute conversation we had before Guthrie pressed the record button, right?
We met one time a few years ago.
We did? Oh, see, now I'm going to be embarrassed.
No,
you're right. Where was that?
It was at the Habit Summit. It was at Near Isles Habit Summit in San Francisco.
And Guthrie, you were there. That was a long time ago.
I remember that.
Wasn't it like 2015 or something like that?
Maybe 16.
I was already at MadPow. I've been there a little over 4 years. So
it must have been somewhere. So 16.
2015, 2017.
Yeah. That was a great conference.
That was really cool.
So, when did your book come out? It's very recent, right?
It is. It came out on March 3rd.
Really recent.
Yeah. Very poor timing with respect to the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, but it's and I know at MadPow, obviously with your title, you do this work, and that's such a funny title, Vice President of Behavior Change. Does anyone ever ask you whether you're responsible for the behavior change of the people at MadPow?
No, but I think it's because we also have a group that's called Design Transformation that specifically focuses on, how teams work together and how they can be effective. So I think they've gotten that question, and I get off the hook because they exist.
That's good. I know that certainly like one of the questions we sort of get asked, or people, it's not even a question, but people just sort of assume that because we deal with behavioral science and because we, talk about processes and communication sometimes and sort of, the corporate culture, that kind of stuff, that like everything we are Jesus and everything we do is perfect, and that all the designs we've ever created, like our website and stuff, are like the pinnacle of design perfection. And it's like, well,
that's true, isn't it? Oh, it's not true. The other thing, here's another thing we get, and Amy, I wonder if you get this. I'm actually I took notes while I was reading your book, so I have a page of notes of things I want to talk about. Hope that's not too nerdy, but one of the things is on page 73, you have you're talking about cognitive bias, which is of course something that we talk about too in our work. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the question we get is, well, because you guys know all about cognitive biases, that means you don't fall prey to them, right? And it's like, no, that's not true. What I usually say is no, but I might recognize faster after I have. But do you ever get that question? People think because you know this stuff, then you won't do it?
Yeah. And I find that it's helpful sometimes to talk about some of my own behavior change struggles. There are certainly things that I'm really good at crafting for myself. So somebody recently asked me this, actually, like, give me an example of a behavior change that you were able to design for yourself successfully and one that you weren't. And I'm really good at exercising. Like, I know myself. I respond really well to accountability. I respond really well to data and feedback. And so years ago, I kind of crafted for myself, this is the way I'm going to do exercise. I'm going to track everything, and I'm going to have this, running list of all the workouts I've done, and I'm going to have goals attached to it, and I'm going to share some of it publicly. And it's been really effective for me. But on the other hand, I actually eat pretty poorly because I love food, and it's part of my social life, or at least it was, but when we still were able to go out to restaurants. And part of the way that I show love for people is cooking and baking. And so, I don't eat nearly as well as you might think from somebody who works in health behavior change. And it's like, I know all the tools. I just can't seem to find the right set to apply to myself because the pleasures I get out of this behavior are so much. And I think it's sort of similar to the cognitive bias thing. Like, I can totally tell you what's going on there, but it doesn't mean that it's easy for me to stop being human and exert my professional skills all the time on myself.
Yeah, behavior change is actually very hard. But one of the problems I have in crafting my own behavior change for myself is I sort of have a problem with authority. And that sort of includes myself. So, it's difficult, Kind of gotta...
You mean if you put together a system for some behavior change, you might not follow through with it because you think you're being too authoritarian on yourself?
I feel like a reverse psychology would be really effective on me. Basically being like, oh, like, you're not good enough to do this, so you're definitely not going to do that. But you can't you can't have like a reverse psychology or like say bad things about yourself, because that's not good either. So it's very difficult.
Yeah, I found not so much for myself, but when I've done work with, when I've done user research and stuff like that, talking to people, that sometimes people who generally have issues with authority are okay with it if they know that it's constrained to a certain area. Like, I'm hiring you to be my coach, and I know that you're going to yell at me and be a drill sergeant, but I also know that that is within the confines of this really specific relationship that I've agreed to, as opposed to it's just going to come out of the blue and, be peppered in with a broader relationship that we have. But it sounds like maybe that doesn't work for you. You can't carve out a little drill sergeant part of yourself.
I mean, I can get there. It's not like I don't have a terrible problem with authority. It's just like a light one, where it's like I'm doing this. Like, if I have like a drill sergeant, like workout coach or something, I would definitely be into it. But really, only because I would maybe like be like that internally anyways. So the drill sergeant, it's nice. It's like I'm happy to go along. But, it's that person sort of bringing out what I already am feeling and doing. So if they're like, hey, go, like, do this other thing, and I don't feel like doing it, I'm going to be like, maybe I just,
So a drill sergeant for the things you were going to do anyway works.
Yes. Yeah, I think that would be good. If I had like a soundtrack to my life, that would be really nice. Like backing music. That would just,
that would be motivating.
Yeah, I think it's going to be intense.
And I think it's this brings up, I think, an interesting point, which is it's complicated to do behavior change, and some of it, and actually this is one of the things on my list that I want to talk about, which is how variables change, because sometimes it changes, but some of it is also, it unfortunately can get down to very specific motivations of a particular person in a particular situation. I mean, I think I don't want people listening to think, oh, see, the stuff they do, it doesn't work because you can't craft behavior change for more than one person. Or maybe you can't even craft it for one person, but you certainly can't craft it for several individuals. But that's not necessarily true, because there are things that we know that most people tend to do or not do in certain situations. But I think oftentimes it does come down to these, Guthrie talks a lot about, how it's very nuanced, and how and I think you said this too, Amy, in your section on behavior change design process. I mean, you can craft a solution that you think will result in behavior change, but you have to test it, because that's when you'll find out that maybe the variables you thought were going to be at play are a little different than the ones that are really at play. And so you've got to change it a little bit based on what you learned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we use the existing science to make our best guess about what will be an effective intervention, how it should look in design, but we absolutely have to test it with the people who'll be using it and in the context that they'll be using it as much as we can. I think we're seeing this right now with coronavirus, actually. It's and it's been frustrating for me, I'll say that, as a behavior change professional, to see that there is such a diversity of behavior around some of these safety measures, like wearing masks and how much and the ways in which people might go use public services. But I think one of the things that we're seeing is that we actually don't know very much about how people behave in a global pandemic because we haven't lived through one before. So we're seeing live the importance of really understanding a context in understanding how people will behave and figuring out the right types of interventions to move their behavior.
One of the tools that I found works especially well for me, I guess I was thinking about this, has been less on the motivation side and more on the habit side.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I leave the wet, soppy sponge out when I do dishes. Just a habit from I never had a place before where you put the sponge back. It has a designated place. So now I'm living with someone who has a designated place for the sponge. And after I wash the dishes, I need to put the sponge back in the designated location. So for the longest time, I just wouldn't, because I never done it in my life. It just wasn't my habit. So, I just, put up a little visual cue for myself so that every time I would wash the dishes, I would see the cue and then remember to put the sponge in. So I was able to kind of get that, and now I do it just fine. And there's been a bunch of those where I can change the behavior through, a cue and then a habit, and then my habit becomes the behavior. That has seemed to be successful, but some of the motivation stuff, I think has been the hardest for me personally, and I wonder if that's true for everyone or if that's just a me thing.
When you say hardest for you personally, do you mean in thinking about how you craft your own behavior, or are you thinking more about when you do your work in designing interventions for other people?
When I'm crafting my own behavior,
I always think of it. So, and I have trouble articulating this, actually. It's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to draw, which is not really a strong skill of mine, so I haven't made it very far there. But when I look at kind of the full toolkit of behavior change tools, there are things like, your nudges, your behavioral economics-based tactics. And I think a lot of what goes into habit formation, I would also put in that sort of toolkit of things that they're more environmental sculpts that will prompt often one-time behaviors, or something like what you mentioned with the sponge. It's a repeated behavior, but there's not necessarily a lot of variation each time you do it. It's a pretty simple, straightforward thing, like takes a couple seconds, then it's done. And I think of those as almost coming at the beginning of a behavior change process. Like you can change your environment, you can set things up so that certain parts of a complicated behavioral routine become really easy to do. You don't have to think about them. But then there's all this stuff that remains hard because it's complicated or it's effortful. I end up talking about exercise a lot here, and I do exercise a lot personally, but I'm not like obsessed with it. It's just a good example that most people are familiar with in terms of an effortful behavior change, where even once you get good at it, there's a significant time that you would be putting into it. You're even things like you're going to sweat on your clothes, right? So you're going to have to take a shower and change your clothes afterwards, most likely. And I think it's really hard to make something like that truly a habit because it just always involves so much stuff, so much preparation, so much planning, so many ancillary behaviors. And so that's where I start to see motivation being more of a necessary thing to think about, because you really need to consciously make that decision each time that, like, maybe you've made certain parts of the behavior habitual. We all have heard the advice about, like, packing your gym bag and putting it by the door so you don't have to hunt around for your stuff. And those things certainly make it easier. But at some point, I think you still do have to make that conscious decision of, okay, I'm going to go out the door now and engage in this activity, and I'm going to do all of the necessary stuff to make it happen. And that's where I think motivation does need to come in. So yeah, I do think it's a little bit more difficult. I have certainly seen people who've put in a lot of work at clarifying what their purpose is. And that's the language that they would probably use, as purpose. And people who have gone through that thought process almost seem superhuman sometimes in their ability to continually connect back to that motivation and figure out how they want to behave based on it. I see that as kind of a goal end state that I personally have not achieved yet.
So can I tell you what was my most successful tactic in going to the gym regularly?
Yeah.
So I like to work out anyways. So like I'm going to work out kind of regardless. I like going to the gym, though obviously there are no gyms open that I'm going to. But the situation that had worked the best for me is I got a gym membership to a gym that was right above my main grocery store. And so if I was hungry and I needed food, I basically had to go to the gym because I was already driving to the grocery store to get food anyways. So that was a great motivator, which is I need to cook dinner. I guess I'm going to the gym today. So that was very useful for me.
And I'm wondering, as I was listening to you talk about this, Amy, it made me think of two things. So one is that I'm a big fan of the idea of self-stories. And I don't know if you know, we talk often, and I talk a lot when I give talks and stuff about Timothy Wilson and his book Redirect. Do you know that book, or do you know?
I do. I have a copy.
Yeah. So we had him on the podcast ages ago, and this idea that the self-story that you have about a particular thing, like exercising or whatever, drives your behavior so much. So if you're like, and often these are unconscious, because I was thinking about what you said about, purposeful, right? Which can often be conscious. But I think there is this, I think if you have a strong unconscious story, purpose, drive, motivation, I think that can be very helpful in driving the conscious behaviors. And I was starting to think about it like schema, this idea of if you have the story that, I'm the kind of person that puts taking care of myself, is a really high priority. And if I'm gonna organize my day, it's not going to go to the bottom of the list. Exercise is going to be at the top of the list because I know that I need to do that in order to really take care of myself. And I'm the kind of person who, that's a high priority. So I just think there's this idea of an organizing schema or principle that if you have that story, it makes all these other things, right, about motivation and about the small steps that lead to the big steps and being purposeful and conscious about it. It just makes all of that so much easier, right? Because it frames your entire series of decisions. The decisions then become very easy and become part of this coherent whole. And, we like coherence, right? We like to think that our actions are in concert with this image we have of ourselves. So for me, like I'm thinking about, I made a big change about a year and a half ago to change. I follow for about a year and a half. I've been following a ketogenic diet, and there's probably people out there that know what that is, and probably people that don't. But let's just say that it's a fairly, one could call it strict. There's lots of things you're not going to eat on a keto diet, and lots of things you are going to eat on a keto diet. And although I ate healthy before, it was a change. It's always a change, and it has been the absolute one of the simplest things I've ever done. I do not. This is not for me. This is not difficult at all. And I think there are a lot of people, I know people who say, oh my God, I couldn't do it. But for me, it's very easy. But I think that's because I made this big unconscious self-story change. And so I am not constantly making decisions every day about, should I eat this or shouldn't I eat that? I think it's easier when you have these if you can turn your behavior into a black and white. I think that, into a yes, no, into a I do this, I don't do this. I remember when, and maybe that's part of habit. I think it is part of habit, because I remember when my children were growing up and they did Suzuki music. I don't know if you know anything about Suzuki music.
No, I don't.
It's a whole way of learning to play an instrument and learning music, and it's what's really big. It's really big. Suzuki, who was a Japanese guy who passed away several years ago, but he had a phrase which is only practice on the days you eat, meaning you have to practice every day. And what I realized with the kids and having the practice and so on was, if we didn't practice every day, then every day we had to stop and make the decision, are we going to practice today? But if that wasn't a question, right? Mm-hmm. If of course you're going to practice, do you eat? Yes. Do you breathe? Yes. Then you're going to practice. Then it became very easy to practice every day, because you brush your teeth every day, you practice music every day. It just was one of those things you do.
Yeah. You brought up a couple things for me when you were just talking there. One is a framework that Gretchen Rubin, actually, are you familiar with her work?
No, I'm not.
Okay, she's actually, I believe she's a journalist by training, but she's written a number of books over the years on happiness, which is a topic that interests me. And then she wrote a book about habits. And I believe that one of her more recent books is also about personality typology. But one of the kind of frameworks that she put forth in her happiness work was that people are either an abstainer or a moderator. So they either have that black and white thinking you were thinking about, or they can, decide this is the behaviors I do and these are the behaviors I don't do. And now it's very easy because every behavior either falls into the yes or the no category. Or then there's the moderators who prefer to make more of a case-by-case judgment. And, these might be the people where it's not black and white. I definitely, in listening to you talk, I personally am much more of a moderator. I don't tend to think of my behaviors in that black or white. And so, I totally agree with you about the schema idea. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it aligns really nicely with the way that self-determination theory talks about motivational quality, right? So if you have these autonomous forms of motivation, what they really are is that you think of yourself a certain way. You have goals and values, and you're a certain type of person, and you're going to do the behaviors that are consistent with that. Of course, then some of the work is helping people see that certain behaviors are consistent with that. You do have to make that realization in order for things to fall into place. But even within that, there can still be some variation. And I mean, to use my exercise example, I don't do the same type of exercise every day. I suppose I get some exercise every day, but it's not the sort of thing that I find easy to totally automate or make habitual, because if you think about, so I'm primarily a runner. And I think a lot about, there are times where I push my distance and try to go longer or faster than I normally do. And then there are times where I'm planning more of a gentle recovery run. And then there are days where I don't want to run at all because I want to give my body a chance to recover. And so there is this sort of conscious decision making with the understanding that I will do some form of this behavior.
Right.
Whereas something like brushing my teeth, that is so routine at this point. Like I always do it in the same place with the same equipment at roughly the same time of day. So even though it also takes a little bit of time, it's a lot easier for me to just do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, this is why, designing for behavior change is a complicated thing, right?
It is. I'll tell you, one of the things I really love about my work is, I do a lot of research where I talk to people, and people are just so different. They're so interesting. Everybody has their own little quirks and the ways that things work for them. And I guess this gets back to your point before as well, that to some degree, really successful behavior change is individual. But when we're thinking about populations, we can make some very good educated guesses that help us build tools that will help a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, because I really do think that, it's just, it's like a paradox, because on the one hand, everyone is different, and they really are. But on the other hand, humans do tend to react very similarly to certain situations. They definitely do.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not generally a fan of large survey research, but one thing that has captured my attention, and I did talk about this a little bit in the book, is there have been a number of surveys of universal human values. What do people care about? If you probe and figure out, their most deep sort of personal values. And these sorts of surveys consistently find that there's a really limited set of things that people value. And to me, that's just so intriguing because, first of all, there are things that I find personally resonant, and that makes total sense, right? If these are universal human values, I'm but it's like, family and community and being a good citizen of the earth and professional accomplishment. And what I take away from that is that even though the way that those things get expressed in any individual's life are going to be very unique and very personal, as designers, we can still create a framework that encourages people to think about those things. What does that mean for you? So we can basically design something that's general but has room for the specific within it.
Right. So a classic example would be, a lot of people, especially in the United States, really believe strongly in liberty. But of course, how you express that, right, whether it's liberty for the individual, where I get to sort of do what I want, or liberty, we have to prevent, the minority groups from being trampled by the majority. Like how you express those ideals, you can be on the exact opposite side of an issue, even though both sides are really just kind of want the same thing. So that makes things difficult.
Yeah, and so I use self-determination theory quite a bit in my work, and one of the reasons I like it is it has a really robust evidence base. It's been around for about 40 years. There's a lot of people who use it and publish on it, so I feel like there's always a good sort of literature review that I can incorporate into my project when I'm using self-determination theory. And so it's been validated globally. But the one difference that seems to come up in terms of people's basic psychological needs is this idea of autonomy, which is having the ability to make personally meaningful choices. That looks different in different cultures, where in some more collectivist cultures, personally meaningful choice could mean like for my family unit or, for the group of people who I basically consider part of myself. So I think that's, first of all, just fascinating. But secondly, what I find funny is even though professionally I really understand this, personally, as someone who grew up in, this individualistic American culture, I'm born and raised in the United States, I'm like, oh, that's so strange. Like, I can't imagine feeling like something that my parents chose for me is personally meaningful. So it's just funny that even with that, I can sort of be a split self and see it differently as from my professional and my personal viewpoints.
Absolutely. Should we talk about speaking as we start to talk about the industry? Should we talk about the industry?
Sure, let's do it.
All right. So behavior change, hot right now. So hot, very very in. Are you feeling that momentum as well?
Yeah, definitely. I got my PhD in 2006 in psychology, and I went directly into industry. And the first few jobs that I had, I felt like I had to apologize for having advanced training in psychology because it was weird. Like, what is somebody with this degree doing looking in for a design job? And I'm exaggerating just a little bit there, but I definitely felt like there wasn't a pattern for me to follow. I had to kind of craft my own job and sort of raise my hand and say, I have this skill set, I can do research, and then I can take insights from that research and help bring it into design, and it's going to do things a little bit differently and hopefully better, or add some positive to the outcome. And I would say in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, all of a sudden I'm seeing job titles that have behavior change in them. My job title has behavior change in it. My company, MadPow, has a behavior change design team, a discipline that my colleague Dustin DiTomaso started about 10 years ago. Like that, I wouldn't have imagined when I started my career. So I'm definitely seeing that there's more of this understanding of what behavior change can bring to various disciplines. And yeah, just someone sent me the other day, McKinsey is trying to hire a behavior what did they call it? I think they called it behavior designer. And of course, the job description for it wasn't probably what you or I would write, but just the fact that, this huge consulting organization is now thinking that behavior change is something they should bring in. I'm like, oh, okay, we are having a moment.
Right. And well, to me, what I find it so interesting is, and I know this happened to Susan with UX when she first, I don't want to say when she first started, a while back, like UX, usability, user experience was this technical niche field where, you had, there were a lot of specialists who this was their thing, and they had degrees in psychology, and it was this very specialized thing, and then it became popular. And suddenly, right, you had this large sophomoric effect where this body of knowledge that was very cool suddenly became dispersed across to everyone. And so today, I think what we find, because we do a fair bit of, more UX things, though we do a lot of behavioral change, behavioral science, behavioral econ stuff too, but also a lot of just kind of nuts and bolts user experience work. The number of people who are doing UX work, who are interested in UX, the number of jobs is way more than it's ever been before. Mm-hmm. And yet the average sort of technical knowledge of the person doing that work has come down. And so I don't know if you're experiencing this too. Maybe both things are happening at the same time. But I'm seeing, for example, a lot of ad agencies. They're running with all of these, a lot of these theories, information, behavior change, behavioral science research in their stuff, but like they're not using the words that I would use. They're not really saying the thing that I would say. It's like it's right, but it's wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And we're not on camera with each other, but I've been nodding my head while you talk. I absolutely, I see that and I struggle with it. One of the reasons I even wrote a book, I've always done a lot of speaking. I like doing that. I go to various events or whatever. I write a lot. And so I would have people reach out to me, probably like 1 or 2 a month, actually. Usually people early in their careers who either had a behavior science background or a UX background, saw the stuff I was doing, thought it was interesting. They were curious about having a career that blends both. And I never was able to find a good resource to point them to that was sort of for the beginning career where, this is a nuanced view of how behavior science could help shape your design skills or be a part of your design toolkit. And so I wrote the book partly to, create that resource for people and encourage people who don't have a very deep or long behavior change background, like maybe somebody who's never taken a psychology course. I think that we can still equip them to do some of these behavior change activities. And I wanted to do that. But I also, and I've said this to people, I'm hopeful that they will simultaneously learn enough through the book and through hopefully some other resources to recognize when there may be a need for, more behavior change sophistication. Because one of the things that I see sometimes, and you mentioned ad agencies, and I think that's a great example of where you sometimes start to get into this gray area where behavior change principles or behavior change tools are used in a way that may not quite be on the right side of the ethical line. And they're not blatantly wrong, but they haven't been chosen with the consideration that somebody who has more training or experience might have put into it. And so I find myself like, on the one hand, I want everybody to use behavior change. I want everybody to be excited about it. But on the other, I realize that there are certain advantages to having people who do have that really deep and long training involved in using it.
Yeah. I mean, we'll have to, at some point we'll talk briefly about ethics. Every podcast we do about behavior eventually just devolves into an ethical conversation. Like I said, every time we talk, we give any talk, that's always the question. So we'll definitely have to address it. And I think maybe Susan said this earlier in our conversation too. Like there tends to be this perception from other people that if you're doing behavior change, like you have total control, you know exactly what outcomes you're going to get, and they're consistent across every person.
Yes, and we're just unwilling to do that because of ethical reasons. We can program you We can, this is mind control. We can take over. We can get you to do anything we want you to do. But we're just not, because we're ethical people. That's not true.
I mean, I do think, though, sometimes people, they're fearful about behavior change because they do think that we have that kind of control, the ability to control people. And if that were true, they'd be right to be afraid.
Can I have two questions, and I guess I'll start with the first.
Mm-hmm.
As just an anecdote for the ad agencies, I could tell you the set of commercials that I dislike the most recently have been the State Farm ad commercials, because they know the research that if you get people's attention, that is successful. And so they put in a bunch of horror movie jump scare stuff where catastrophes are happening. This is the essence of all the commercials. Chris Paul is standing around, there's a deer that suddenly pops up and destroys things, and there's loud screeching noises and things are exploding, and it's very thing. And then everyone looks at each other and laughs. I was like, oh well, but it's, to me, as someone, who kind of works in this industry, it's very obvious what they're doing, and I'm sure it's successful, but
they're getting the heart rate up.
It kind of annoys me, and now it's happened, because it'd be one thing if it was one ad, but now it's starting to be campaign after ad campaign after ad campaign, and it's becoming very, very prevalent. So that was just my anecdote. You could feel free to comment on that if you want. The other question I had was, if I know the two of you, your background is in psychology, and I was just curious if you had thoughts and musings on the bodies of research between behavioral psychology and behavioral economics, because when we talk about behavior change, especially if you look at the research papers, they're just written in such a totally different way. It's such a different way of looking at behavior change from a kind of decision tree, economics, variable, blah, 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 versus the brain science, what's going on in the brain pathways, research. So those are my two things. Feel free to comment.
Go
for it.
Well, I have to say, I agree. I don't think I've seen those specific State Farm commercials, but I have noticed, that of course every brand is bringing out their, pandemic commercials, and some of them just are so obviously crafted to tug on the heartstrings, and it just drives me crazy. And I'm sure that they're effective with some people, but I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, it's so obvious what you're doing, and like so manipulative. So I agree with that. In terms of the two bodies of research, this is another one where I struggle because, I think on the whole, the fact that behavioral economics exists is a good thing, because it is creating a bigger shared understanding of the way that humans behave and the way that we can help to shape the environment and various experiences in order for people to achieve positive outcomes. So, on the whole, I think it's a really great thing. I have been very frustrated, though, because I think behavioral economics is accessible to people in a way that psychology has not been. So specifically, I think nudges are really capturing people's imagination. And I don't think that I don't think that Thaler and Sunstein would agree that this is correct about nudges. But my perception in talking to clients and people who are interested in using behavior science in projects is that nudges feel like magic tricks. Like, this is a specific thing that I can do, and it's going to reliably yield a certain outcome. And so let's build a website that's full of nudges that will lead people to buy our product, or, whatever the outcome is that the client is looking for. And there really is and needs to be a much more nuanced conversation, again, about other dynamics that may be at play. It's not always as simple as nudging somebody to a specific single behavior. Like, sometimes you're really looking for a more involved or deliberate behavior, or something that has to take place repeatedly over time. And behavioral economics, I don't think always deals as well with that as some of the psychological theories and approaches do. And then, understanding context as well. So I think behavioral economists understand that, and they approach it with all of that nuance, but the general public just sees like, oh, nudges, let's do those. And so there's been some frustration for me in navigating that with, the non-expert audiences, I guess I'll say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when you get a copy of my book, I have it's 2 pages just about nudges, where I actually go and get some Richard Thaler quotes about what he thinks a nudge is. And I've seen it in my professional life where I see a lot of people talking about nudges, and they keep saying nudges, and it's just manipulations. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, that's not a nudge. And Mr. Thaler, in his own words, he's like, he compares a nudge to a GPS system. Like, you want to go to this certain place, I am helping you get there. But you're free to turn left or right. You don't have to follow the map at any time. And if you do that, then we'll just help sort of redirect you to get you to your goal. And that's very different than let's just hide the telephone number so no one calls customer service. Nudges have become very popular, but you're totally right. The sort of the nuance and what they actually mean, and the sort of that sort of goes out the window, because it's a lot easier to get short-term results if you just kind of use sort of a brute force economic model.
Yeah, and I wrote an entire chapter on trust in my book, partly because one of the things I think, and there's all kinds of reasons for this, I think in general, in the United States at least, the way that our society operates from a business perspective is really geared towards short-term results, making sure that the next month or the next quarter looks good. And so, at least in my experience as a consultant, I will have clients who will say, like, yeah, bury the 1-800 number, because calls into the helpline are a key metric. And if we report that those calls are high, then, that's no good for us. We want to reduce time on phone. And what they're not thinking about is the longer term relationships that they can have with their customers. So if you may need to invest more upfront, you may need to go through more of those pain points, take the call on the 1-800 line and help somebody through their issue. But in doing so, you secure their loyalty, and you learn things about your product that help you to improve it, so that people aren't calling the 1-800 number, not because they can't find it, but because they don't need to call it. So, I think there's really, I would just love to see us able to think more over the long term as opposed to the short term. And I don't think that, I'm not necessarily blaming companies or individual people for this, because like I said, I do think that our society is kind of set up to force this focus on the short term, but ultimately I think it's to our detriment.
One thing my undergrad degree is in economics. So mm-hmm. I do sort of think, or worry is not the right word, but if there's going to be sort of a Jets versus Sharks, psychologists versus economics, who gets to claim the behavioral science hill mm-hmm. and plant the flag, because it's two very different ways of doing research and doing. I mean, a lot of those behavioral economics studies, they do a couple cool stuff with some live people, and then they just come up with a theoretical model that is kind of close to the way the world works, but not really. But that's the whole point, is just to be theoretical and see how the different levers and stuff move. And mm-hmm. it's just totally not what the behavioral psychologists want to do at all. and so there's this very strange push and pull, and some of course some people are able to just very gracefully slide right in the middle and do a little bit of both, the Ariellis of the world, who kind of can dance above those things. But I don't know. So I try not to get I try not to do my side versus other side, but I do kind of always cough into my shoulder. I was like, Kahneman and Tversky were there first.
I know. Yeah, and I just what is the book, the Michael Lewis book? The Undoing Project. I just read that about Kahneman and Tversky and their relationship. But I remember, when did Nudge come out? 2010, 2011? I finished
sneaky old book, by the way.
I mean, I had finished grad school before that came out, so nudges weren't a thing yet. But I remember reading Kahneman and Tversky and thinking this is really useful stuff. This is a really useful way to understand some of the cognitive biases that people bring to their behavior. I didn't imagine at that time, though. I guess I also didn't really know as much about the context because I was reading it more in terms of my general psychology education. But, not understanding that this was the field of economics starting to bring in some human irrationality and like closing that chasm.
Yes, and I should just briefly say for the field of economics, the idea of bringing humans into the equation, which you would think would be a pretty smart thing to do, that has been very much revolutionizing many fields of economics for the last 40 years, and not just on the behavioral side. So when I was in college, all the econ Nobel Prizes that were being handed out, a lot of them were for frictions, time delays, basically humans being messy, and meaning that things weren't happening instantly, and the implications of that on microeconomics. So this idea that, well, oh, wait, humans are not these perfect vehicles, and so there's noise, and there's stickiness, and there's messiness, and this has been, from my vantage point, the economics has been trying to incorporate that for 40 years, somewhat successfully, mostly unsuccessfully. But
because the implication, and this is so funny because talking about this, because our business reflects this, right? Because I'm the psychologist, you're the economist, and I think we've brought the two together fairly well, but maybe not. But to me, the economics side is kind of underneath the economics part of it, in my opinion. It's like, oh, those pesky humans messing up our models, and or just the fact that Ariely's book is called Predictably Irrational, and then I complain about that all the time because it's like it's not irrational. People are not being people are being people. This is what humans do. This is human behavior. There's actually nothing irrational about it.
Yeah. I actually lived out a version of this struggle earlier because my PhD is in organizational psychology. So
hold on. As the non-psychology PhD person in the room, can you just explain?
You mean what is that? You want to know what that is?
You guys just moving right along.
So it's basically applied social psychology, focusing specifically on people's behaviors in organizations. And, in terms of my individual research, I'm not a hardcore organizational psychologist by any means. I'd say I'm more of a social psychologist who wanted to work with a professor who was in an organizational psychology program. But the coursework that I was required to take was half in the psychology department and then half in the business school in the human resources and organizational behavior area. And a lot of those classes took this populations view of organizations. So I had one professor, I absolutely adore him as he's a brilliant man and a great teacher and a wonderful human, but I hated his class because he would talk about these population ecology studies of organizations where they basically look at macro data. So you might look at a market and see over time, which organizations expand through, acquisition or other growth and which ones go out of business. And then they would create these behavioral models, but they would never actually look at individual people at all. It was just based on this sort of macro data. And I remember sitting in the classroom with him and being like, where are the people? And he's like, organizations are people. It was such a frustration to me. And I remember, I specifically remember because, like I said, the reason that I even went into that program was I really wanted to work with one of the faculty members there, and she'd accepted me to be her student. So it was sort of like, all right, I'll change my area of study a little bit so that I can work with this person. And I remember thinking oh God, I'm not going to make it in an org psych program. This is not for me. And it worked out, especially as I gained some confidence and realized that I didn't necessarily have to be a population ecologist in order to be an organizational psychologist. But Yeah, wow, that was hard.
Well, a lot of times if you can, it's very complex, and if you can figure out how to bridge, I mean, at least mathematically, if you can figure out how to bridge the microeconomic behaviors with the macro level theories, you're on the short list for Nobel Prizes basically every year. So it's not exactly an easy problem to solve. I can say it's probably a big factor in not talking about the people.
All right, I have another book question.
Okay.
Which is let's see, Guthrie just finished filming, and Guthrie, you have to remind me, did we publish this course yet?
Which one?
Behavioral design process.
Yeah. It's up everywhere.
Because I couldn't remember.
Because we haven't our workshop schedule is non-existent anymore. So
except now we're starting to do some online workshops, but we had this whole, I'm sure this was true for you too, Amy. We had this, our March, April, May, June was just packed with in-person workshops and speaking gigs, and then it all disappeared, right? Really quickly with COVID. So
we've been filming a lot.
We've been filming
because
we have this backlog of online video courses to create, and so we just okay, let's work on that. So we've been filming those. So we have all these courses, some of which are done, some of which we're in the middle of, and I can't remember sometimes whether we published one or not.
Yeah, BDP is done and published.
We just published a course on, what we use as a behavioral design process. And so then when I was reading your book, I said to Guthrie, Amy has a behavioral design process. So, which was kind of fun to see. And although, you use different terms for things, I'm sure there's probably a lot our process has in common with your process. But do you want to just talk about that for a minute? Like what, do you think a behavioral design process, going through a process, if you want to do behavioral change design, is that important? And, what are the important parts of the process, and what is following a process by you? And
yeah, I do think using a process is important for two kind of separate sets of reasons. One is for organizing the work and the people on the team, and especially, in my situation, I very rarely work with other behavior change people. So I do have a team at work of others who have that expertise, but on a typical project, there's only one of us, and we're working embedded in a team of other design professionals. So I'm kind of representing behavior change design and making sure that gets built into the way that we do the project. Having a clear process really helps me to make sure that happens, and that other people on the team who may not have the same level of expertise or familiarity that I do can clearly understand the role that they need to play in that. So that's one thing. But then two, I think that having a process is really important in order to get to the right outcomes. And the specific piece that I think is just so critical, the discipline that, if I just had to pick one thing that we absolutely can't get rid of in the process, is going through the exercise up front of really defining which behaviors you are going to change and how you're going to know if you were successful in doing that.
Does it sound familiar, Guthrie?
Hey, I have the unfortunate news that we completely agree in every facet of our. We independently both discovered calculus at the same time.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I think I may have even made this. I may have made this point in the book. I definitely made it verbally. I do think that most people who follow a behavior change design process, regardless of the labels that we use, it's basically the same process. It follows the scientific model, right? You come up with a hypothesis and you want to be super clear about it, and then you go gather the evidence to test it, and you refine based on what you learn. The way that you might break that out into phases, or what you might call them, your mileage may vary there, but we're really all approaching it pretty similarly, and that's a good.
The process that we kind of came up with is very, very heavy on the initial step. What are the outcomes that you want? What is it? Be very clear. Make sure everyone agrees. that on the behavior you want to change. Because we find, I mean, we've seen this in a number of our clients where you go into a room and like the person who's in charge of marketing wants this behavior change because that's their metrics, and then the person in charge of IT is like, well, we can't do any of that, and then the other so it's just everyone sort of has what you want, and you usually can't get all of it at the same time. You got to pick your priorities. So yes, ours is also front loaded because that's where a lot of the sort of problems and stickiness are. And
we really love it. When we had a case not too long ago where we were going to be meeting with a client. We were going to be meeting with the whole C-level team of the whole company, which was great.
Medium
right?
size, medium small. This is
small
not
company,
Target or anything crazy.
No, but we're going to get them all the C-level people in the room at the same time for like what was it, like a full day, which is like, usually don't have that opportunity. So this was going to be great. We're going to get them all in. And so I think we had asked beforehand, Guthrie, for if we could talk to people and just find out, right, what the outcomes were that this person was looking for versus this person. Mm-hmm. And the person we were working with, who was one of the C-level people who was putting this all together, said to us, oh, we don't need to do that. And you don't need to have that at the beginning of the workshop day because we are all in agreement. And we were like, sure, great.
Then it should only take a few minutes, right?
Right. So we decided not to fight about it and we just said, great, that sounds great. And of course, we planned our day on the fact that we were going to spend a good chunk of the time at the beginning getting this straightened out. And it was true and they all thought, right? They all thought they were in agreement. But when we went around the room and asked, right, at what the outcomes would be and how you would measure that, they were not at all in agreement. So it was good. I mean, it was great fun to bring the group to agreement on it. But I think, so I'm pretty sure our process stuff is the same.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So another thing that I've sort of noticed is that a lot of times when we ask people, so what are you trying to achieve? Like, right? Like what you want to, you're trying to do with something. What is it that's important to you? I find that a lot of times we're told, hey, we want higher customer engagement and we'd like more conversions and we want our net promoter score to go up or whatever it is. But so they kind of say all these things that are important, and then at every single juncture, if the question is, if we just do this, will we make more money? They always pick the thing that's just like make more money. Mm-hmm. And so they say these things that they say they're important, and it turns out the only thing that matters is just increasing revenue, and then everyone's happy.
Yeah, I think that gets back a little bit to some of the, what are people rewarded for in the way that our corporate culture is set up. I don't think we're ever going to get fully rid of a focus on profits. That's kind of why businesses exist in a lot of cases. But this short-term focus, I think you're exactly right. Like, what is going to make me more profit now? What's going to bring in more revenue right now? And that isn't always the same thing that is going to be effective for the long haul, unfortunately. And so I think that's often the piece that we have to tease out with clients, really understanding like, okay, you can maximize your revenue right now, but you're going to see a lot of churn in your customers, or, you're not going to realize this potential huge profit later.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hey, Amy, I can't believe we managed to use up an entire hour. I think we could probably talk to you for like 4 hours, but we may have to have you back on so we can talk more. But I do want to say before we let you go, I do want to encourage our listeners to check out your book. It's called Engaged: Designing for Behavior Change, and we'll put this in the show notes and have a link and so on. But thank you. Oh, I do have a question before I thank you.
I have a question too.
Let you go.
All right.
My question is, if people want to reach you, what's the best way for them to get hold of you?
Oh, that's a great question. So I am on Twitter. My handle is Amy B PhD. And then
That's
Wait a minute,
good.
say that again.
Oh, that's
what?
good.
Amy B, PhD.
Dang.
Amy,
So,
PhD.
Rhymes and
Amy.
everything.
Okay.
AMYB, PhD.
IB, PhD. Got it.
And
Okay. Yes.
then, I'm on LinkedIn. You can email me, abucher@madpow.net, or, I'm all over the web. So, but Twitter tends to be a good one. I like being on Twitter. I find that I have a lot of great conversations on there, often with people I otherwise wouldn't have met. So it's one of my favorite ways to chat with new people.
Okay. And Guthrie, what
yes,
did you
my
want
question.
to say?
I had to ask the one quick question about ethics on a scale of 1 to 10.
Oh my God, we didn't talk about ethics.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
now we're in trouble.
That didn't pass. Yeah, but
Okay,
on a
so-
scale of just 1 to 10 with worry, where 1 is it never crosses my mind, and 10 is catastrophic doom for society. How worried are you about ethics of people using the unlocked magic's not the right, the unlocked power of this sort of new field in unethical ways?
I'm probably about a 6. I think that there are, so we talked a little bit before about, behavior change is really hot right now. And I think one of the good things that's happening is we're building up a corpus of, qualified, ethical, caring professionals who are out there doing the work to mitigate some of the misuse of these techniques. And so that's why I'm only a 6 and not like an 8 or a 9. I do think there are some, there's some bad actors who want to manipulate people, and then there are some folks who just don't know better. But fortunately, there's also a lot of us who are out there trying to make sure that these things are used correctly. And so at least in the near term, I think that as long as we keep up our vigilance and keep making sure that we have a voice in the conversation, we'll be able to stave off anything too bad, I hope.
Cool. Wow. Hey, that's a nice optimistic note.
I'm trying.
She's pretty optimistic.
Yeah, Susan's always a pessimist about everything. So,
I have not felt optimistic lately, I have to tell you. So I'm actually really happy to hear you say that. I feel reassured that I'm not losing my soul in the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Amy, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you both. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Yes, that's
All
great to me. Thank you.
Stay in touch.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.